Thomas Jefferson and his Republican followers have an almost idyllic image of the America they like to promote. Families living on farms and in small villages, working to help their neighbors and their community, free of government interference, and certainly free of the urban, industrial squalor that is so common in Europe.
The Constitution was, in effect, revised or amended by the ascension of Jefferson in the election of 1800. Jefferson set the nation off on an entirely new course.
And what republicanism postulated, in theory, was a republic with a small, weak central power, just enough to keep things kind of going, and the true rulers would be the citizens. And of course, they were understood to be male and white and property owners. So what's going to keep everything together? Well, the theory was virtue. They were depending on the citizens of the country to put the public good above private interest.
It was a distributed, economically distributed culture, so that churches and town meetings and other kinds of social institutions worked pretty effectively to create a civil society. And while he never used the term, that is surely what Thomas Jefferson was talking about when he imagined small agricultural communities as the way to go. And that's, again, why he said that government is best that governs least. It's because he thought small groups of people could govern themselves. So they had community, and community is at the heart of civil society. And in American history, the problem is what happens to community when you begin to industrialize and urbanize. So the 19th century becomes a very interesting and difficult picture of the transformation of civil society.
Republicans call for a nationwide system of public schools.
Tied to the expansion in the West is a sense of building communities with schools, with elementary schools, and having children go to school and having it be a responsibility of the state. For Jefferson, a good citizen is an educated citizen.
This definition, however, does not necessarily extend to women.
And there are a few women from more elite families, and often men and their families involved in the revolutionary movement, who are thinking, well, if we're going to be thinking about a Republican government, we're going to be thinking about citizenship and some notion of equality, perhaps we should be thinking about women too. It's a very unpopular idea. It doesn't go very far. But the fact that some women who are reading history and reading politics and talking about politics with the men in their families who are involved, they have that vision already at the turn of the 19th century.
At the time of the Revolution, only about half of the women in the country could read and write. But that state of affairs is changing.
In fact, there's even, I think, a 4th of July sermon given around 1800 or so, which is every man in America can dream of growing up to become president of the United States, and every young woman in America can grow up to dream of becoming the mother of the president of the United States. Now, that might sound discriminatory, and in the long political view, it was excluding women from the rights of citizenship, the full rights of citizenship. But it was a wedge. And the key place of that wedge is education.
By the 1790s, only a small portion of white Americans belonged to a traditional church. The new theologies that are emerging reflect modern scientific attitudes and de-emphasize the role of God in the world. But beginning in 1801, traditional religion stages a dramatic comeback.
The Second Great Awakening starts in Kentucky and Tennessee with a series of quite spectacular emotional frontier revivals. The fellow who is to the Second Great Awakening what George Whitefield was to the first is a former lawyer turned Presbyterian minister by the name of Charles Finney. It is Finney who is the great impresario of revivalism. In fact, he even writes a book on the subject about how, quite specifically, you go into a town and do your advance work and then proceed to conduct your revival. So Finney is a fascinating character, a rationalist and an empiricist in a sense, who really believes that you can do certain things quite scientifically to create an upswelling of religious enthusiasm.
What is also new about the Second Great Awakening is its link to social reform.
And so there are a whole bevy of organizations that come out of the first half of the 19th century for distributing Bibles, distributing tracts, organizations that get together and collect money for missionaries, both at home and abroad. And then, of course, temperance organizations, organizations to redeem prostitutes, anti-slavery organizations. And so the distinctive feature of popular religious expression in the Second Great Awakening is that people move from revivals to these various forms of social activism, which are quite deliberately engineered by the astute clergymen who thought them up, both to do good and to prolong the intensity of popular religious commitment.
Despite their intentions, almost nothing works out as Jefferson and his followers planned. During their years in power, the young republic develops in ways they could not have envisioned.
In some ways, the most striking, inescapable aspect of American society in the early decades is the extraordinary economic vitality and the bustle, the economic, the growth, the productivity, the increasing sophistication and diversification, just the tremendous unleashing of productive power in those decades is remarkable. I think maybe that would be the big story. The dynamism of society generally, migration to the West, but also migration from the countryside to cities, allied to a series of changes. Economic growth, obviously, economic opportunity. So young men and women would up and go to the cities, and lots of cities. It wasn't just New York and Boston. They would go to Rochester, which booms in this period with the opening of the Erie Canal.
The cities of the early 1800s are what urban historians refer to as compact.
You don't need to tell the difference of where the city limits are. It's perfectly obvious. One moment you're on a farm, and the next moment you're in this tight little built-up environment. And to the extent that you could generalize about where would be the desirable places to live, they would tend to be toward the middle, so that you might go to work, but you would either work upstairs or somewhere else and maybe go a couple blocks, but you wouldn't go very far.
Virtually every household engages in some form of cottage industry or other. There is a kind of voice that women develop out of this capacity to earn their own keep and to be responsible for their own well-being.
During these years, the nation is also taking steps toward industrialization.
The South doesn't industrialize until after the Civil War in any significant way, whereas the North industrializes very rapidly, beginning you could say beginning in the early 19th century, but certainly by the 1810s and 1820s, with the beginning of the cotton mills.
The invention of the cotton gin, which transforms the agricultural economy of the South, impacts the North as well. A large supply of domestically produced fiber is a stimulus for Yankee ingenuity.
One of the things that we ought to know about industrialization is almost every industrial country begins with textile factories. And the labor in those textile factories is most often women and children at the beginning of the process. So young women, instead of working in their own homes, migrate to whatever the nearest small town or mill town is. Men's and women's lives change with industrialization, but it's women's lives that change most dramatically, and especially for the sort of poor and middling sort of woman who expects to have to earn her own living or keep herself at least until she's married, when both her status and her economic circumstances change.
There are unexpected developments on the international scene as well, as Napoleon Bonaparte begins secret negotiations with Spain to regain title to Louisiana. At first, Jefferson is unaware of Napoleon's imperial ambitions. When rumors begin to surface, he is justifiably alarmed.
The major concern for Jefferson and other Republicans, in fact for all Americans, was that a strong European power at the mouth of the Mississippi could have a devastating effect on the future of the country. As long as New Orleans was Spanish, it wasn't a threat. And when Napoleon threatens to establish through his Western design, which would include the Mississippi Valley as kind of a breadbasket for his French possessions in the West Indies, and controls commerce through the Mississippi, Americans knew each other well enough to know that their cousins on the west of the Appalachians would come to terms with the French and would secede from the United States.
Jefferson instructs Robert Livingston, American ambassador to France, to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans. As a backup plan, he persuades Congress to appropriate funds to expand the army and construct a river fleet.
And France is afraid that it's about to lose Louisiana, the whole territory stretching up to the borders of the Oregon country, to Great Britain as soon as war breaks out. So Napoleon basically, through Talleyrand, makes a deal with the American ambassador, and that's, well, we'll sell you New Orleans, but the catch is that you have to take all of Louisiana territory, which you'd think would not be much of a catch. They'd grab at it, but there's a great deal of doubt here. Not that Jefferson is afraid of getting Louisiana, because he wants the land for future agricultural expansion, but he doesn't think the president has the authority to acquire a large tract of land from a foreign country without the permission of Congress. He suggests to the French that perhaps they might want to wait while he gets permission from Congress. He might even need a constitutional amendment. They tell him, in effect, forget it. You either take it now or you lose it. They take it now. The United States buys Louisiana territory. And the last part of it is they don't know exactly what they bought, because the boundaries of this are not very clear.
And the price tag for this vast expanse of territory? 80 million francs. $15 million in U.S. currency.
Virtually all parts of the country were enthusiastic. The great exception would be Federalists in New England, who were concerned about the addition of a vast new territory. And the fear in New England was not only that they were losing power because they were being outnumbered, but then a nation or a union of agricultural states with their own peculiar interests would be at odds with the commercial interests of New England, would be perhaps hostile to that strong Anglo-American connection that they had cultivated over the years. This is an important thing to keep in mind, because there's a partisan geopolitical motive in expansion. The new states sponsored by the Jefferson administration quickly aligned themselves behind Jefferson.
The addition of the Louisiana Territory doubles the size of the nation. Few Americans, however, really know what they've bought or what to do with it.
Jefferson himself didn't know what to do with Louisiana Purchase because it fell in his lap. And he'd already, before the purchase was completed, begun plans to send Lewis and Clark into the region to get the lay of the land.
Meriwether Lewis and William Clark begin their journey to the Northwest in the spring of 1804 with just a few dozen men, horses, and supplies.
They know that in order to survive, in order for the United States to establish itself in vying for Indian trade in various places, they know that the United States will have to accommodate Indians. And they become quite well practiced in the art of that kind of intercultural negotiation.
For Lewis and Clark, besides trading, they were giving away things, presents to people. The finding of Sacagawea was just incredible for the success of the journey. Having a woman with them indicated to other Indian tribes that this was not a war party, but most important, hitting the Rocky Mountains and then needing horses, and then finding the Shoshones and the chief Camille Waite, Sacagawea's brother, was just incredible. And without that, I'm not sure that they could have got across the Lemhi Pass and moved into the Bitterroot Valley. That saved the expedition.
Lewis and Clark and other early explorers were not necessarily primarily looking for future homesteads for American farmers. There was plenty of land east of the Mississippi for that. In fact, Jefferson had two different ideas that seem rather curious in retrospect. One is that the whole region could be preserved for the Indians, as, after all, Jefferson and his heir, Jackson, had between them, in effect, initiated and completed the policy of Indian removal to the trans-Mississippi region. That was one plan. Another that seems even more bizarre is that perhaps it could be a repository for freed people, that is, emancipated slaves. And the important point is that Jefferson didn't contemplate at first this infinite expansion or replication of Republican governments across the continent.
As governor of the Indian Territory, William Henry Harrison has been playing one tribe against another for years, signing treaties to gain Indian land and to implement Jefferson's policy of assimilate or move west of the Mississippi. Late in Jefferson's second term as president, however, Native American resistance begins to solidify.
Tecumseh's brother had a revelation, and it said that he died, that the people were preparing him for burial, and that he came back to life. These kind of death and rebirths among American Indians is very common historically, and that the people should unify and not allow the United States to move any closer, and that Indian people who had fought each other started unifying. And even Tecumseh grew to appreciate his brother's teachings. And so Tecumseh went around, including into the South, trying to unify the tribes.
Meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars begin to interfere with America's expanding shipping industry.
It was a lose-lose situation, how to negotiate the troubled waters in the Napoleonic Wars. It's important to keep in mind that the Jeffersonians, as much as the Federalists, were determined to maintain neutrality. So the dilemma for Jefferson is that belligerent talk and the effort to vindicate neutral rights went for him hand in hand with a failure to prepare.
In the interim, what Jefferson sought to do was to impose an embargo. And that put the Customs Service in a very difficult position because, of course, they saw themselves as developing and articulating what this commercial republic was and how it ought to develop further and prosper. And yet here was Thomas Jefferson saying we had to put essentially restrictions on that by imposing an embargo.
The embargo triggers a serious economic depression. Hardest hit are the merchants and ship owners of the Northeast, most of them Federalists.
It's one of the great tragic set pieces of American political history. It led Jefferson into wholesale invasions of civil rights and liberties, trying to keep Americans from trading abroad. It was logistically impossible and required the use of federal power in the court systems in a way that was effectively nullified throughout much of New England. In fact, Jefferson's reverence or respect for local self-government was reinforced by New England's resistance to his embargo. But of course, the ultimate disaster was that that war came nonetheless, and it was called Mr. Madison's War, but it was really Mr. Jefferson's war.
The election of James Madison as president in 1808 continues the procession of Republican presidents from Virginia, although the Federalists capture an increased number of votes. In his final days in office, Jefferson signs a bill to lift the embargo.
Jefferson dealt in large generalities and in principles that he didn't question deeply. Madison went over those in detail, and he had a quizzical mind, and he kept chopping up these questions into small pieces and trying to figure out the intricacy of them in ways that Jefferson and no other person at the time really did. He was the foremost intellect of that era. However, unlike Jefferson, he was not a good administrator. He was not a very good politician.
The politician in the Madison family is the president's wife, Dolly.
She had a warm, accessible personality. She was very charming. She was very social. And her husband, James Madison, was almost the opposite. He was very shy. Often people wouldn't even notice him at his own parties. I think it's a clue that they were very similar in height. But everybody describes Dolly Madison as this sort of larger-than-life figure, and James Madison as this sort of tiny, wizened little schoolmaster who looked like he just whipped one of his schoolboys. He seems the embodiment of the sober, virtuous Republican. But Dolly Madison does all the political stuff that the country needs.
Indian uprisings, encouraged and supported by British agents in Canada, and the cutoff of trade with Europe, pushed the nation toward conflict with Great Britain.
Congress was divided over whether or not to declare war on Great Britain. And in fact, it was this issue that resulted in the congressional overturn of 1810, which replaced some huge proportion of the members of Congress, and there was a new group in town, the War Hawks, led by John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, and they wanted war. James Madison, for the most part, did not want war, but it became clear to some people, including to Dolly Madison, that he would never win the presidential election of 1812 unless he did.
There's some reason to think that the embargo and later non-intercourse acts did have a long-term effect on the British, and the British were getting ready to deal. They withdrew their orders of council just before the Americans declared war.
In the summer of 1812, American forces invade Canada through Detroit, but they are soon forced to retreat and surrender the fort. Fort Dearborn in Chicago is also captured. Harrison leads the counterattack in the west. Andrew Jackson pursues the tribes of the Southwest.
In the end, at the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh loses. He fights to the end and is killed. But he still serves as a symbol to many Native people to resist, to remember that this is a Native America, and that Indian people must stand against injustices as they see injustices. In the aftermath of the war, then, the tribes were spent. They had tried unification, they had tried a military means of standing against the United States, and none of this had worked. And so they needed to find a new way of survival, a new way of fighting the United States.
The victories over the tribes, however, are not enough to win the war.
In August of 1814, the British march on Washington City, and they burn the White House down, in addition to other government buildings. And they do this for very obvious reasons. They think, according to their foreign intelligence, that the Americans aren't very united. There's a lot of fighting between these sort of parties, Federalists and Republicans. And it's such a small capital and so weak and not really developed. They think if they just come in and burn it, that the whole Republican experiment will fall apart. And they were almost right. But what they hadn't counted on was that far from being demoralized, the American citizenry, who up to this point had not been too supportive of the War of 1812, were galvanized into action, and though the war would only last a few more months, fought very hard for their new country because they were insulted by what had happened.
The Americans didn't lose it, and that's all that was necessary. Despite a symbolic slap in the face with the burning of Washington, the British had no interest in reestablishing an empire in the United States. It was a sideshow for the British, who were intent on destroying Napoleon in Europe. And one of the things that's hard for us to understand now is how Americans could have interpreted their survival as a great victory. They did so because, again, the standard was that a people's government, a republic, had withstood the greatest power on earth. It had not lost.
And then several incidents happened that were somewhat coincident, but fortuitous. And one was the Hartford Convention. And as you know, there were some New Englanders who conspired to basically secede from the Union. When the Hartford Convention was on their way to Washington and heard about Andrew Jackson's, decisive battle, even though the war was over, that movement completely fell apart.
Those people who were enthusiastic supporters for the war knew what a near thing it had been, how close the Americans had come to losing the war or having to negotiate a much less favorable peace than they were able to negotiate, because they see that the survival of Jefferson's Union, a union of free Republican states, is impossible in a dangerous world without some institutions of federal authority that can effectively manage a war effort. And it's really the most eloquent commentary on Americans' near disastrous loss of that war that the victors would say, to consolidate this victory, we're going to have to prepare better for the next war. And every American leader of this generation knew there would be another war. The irony is they didn't know that that war would be a war among Americans.